Yes. Hey, Dennis, how's it going?
Hi, good. How are you doing?
You in my former state that I loved and lived in for so much, Arizona?
Yeah, no, I'm not. I left the Arizona Republic about 18 months ago, and I work for USA Today, and I'm based in sunny San Diego.
Oh, okay. The climate there is a lot less hot, isn't it, in San Diego? It's still
It
quite
sure
hot,
is.
but yeah, on the coast. I had a girlfriend, and her parents had two houseboats in San Diego. We used to go and stay on the houseboats. It was really nice down there. All
Yeah,
right, so you've got some history with. We both have some history with Sammy the Ball Gravano, apparently.
yeah, I guess so. Tell me about yours first. I can't remember how it worked.
So there was an article in the Phoenix New Times that talked about the ecstasy trafficking ring that I ran in competition with Sammy the Bull Gravano. And National Geographic have just put out a documentary called How E Busted the Bull, which features both of our rings. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to see that yet. It's only just come out recently.
I'm actually in it.
Oh, you're in it? Okay. There you go then. We're both in it. We're both in it. Yes. And so that's my history. But do you want to tell the viewers a bit about yourself first and how you came to end up in Arizona?
Yeah, I'm a journalist, and I got a job in Arizona way back in the 1980s, and I was an investigative reporter in 1999 when I got a tip that Sammy the Bull was living in Phoenix area in Tempe, and I honestly didn't know who he was at the time. I kind of had the name registered, but I didn't know anything about him. And I didn't have any more information in the tip than that he was living there and it would be a great story to track him down. So I started doing research and I was getting nowhere because I knew he would be under an alias. He'd already been convicted in connection with his mob activity, which included a role in 19 homicides, and he had served time. So I got he co-authored a book or had a book ghost written, and I read the book and learned a lot about him. I started trying to look up his name, but I knew that wasn't going to work because had gone into witness protection. And then just by chance, I did some public record searches where I threw in his last name with no other name. And there was a business in Scottsdale registered to Gerard Gravano, that was his son, and Deborah Gravano, that was his wife. Wow, that's pretty interesting. It was called Uncle Sal's Italian Restaurant. So it was pretty well tip off that I was on the right track. And then I found a company registered to the Gravano, to his wife and son. And that company was called Marathon Development. And it was the same company that it's the same name as the company he had in New York City years earlier. So I pretty much knew what was going on. So then I did a bunch of more research and found that there was criminal cases against his son in Arizona and that his daughter also lived there and had some court cases. And then I went and got a meatball sandwich at Uncle Sal's restaurant.
And did Gerard serve that up for you?
No, he did not. Somebody else served it up, and it was very good, by the way. This was in Scotland, and it was a brutal hot day in the summertime, I remember. And I didn't know what to do. I was about the only customer in there, except for two guys that had rolled-up T-shirts with cigarette pack. One of them had a cigarette pack and the rolled-up T-shirt. It was almost like a cliche. There was hardly anybody else in the place. And then right as I finished, a woman walked past me and I recognized her picture from his book, and it was Deborah Gravano. So I followed her outside and I said, "Hi, I'm Dennis Wagner with the Arizona Republic, and I was hoping to speak with you and your husband." And she got all flustered and said she couldn't talk and took off. And I thought that was really dumb because now I've picked him off that I'm working on a story and I haven't even seen him. What do? Well, I decided to jump in my car and immediately drive to Marathon Development. And I did. And I got there. This was before cell phones, so all I had was a pager, and I hadn't told my editors what I was doing. So I was nervous. I drove around the place a few times, but I didn't have air conditioning in my car, and I finally decided the heat was going to kill me if I didn't do something. So I walked, and Gravano, I ring a little bell in the foyer because nobody is there, and I look down way down the hall, and Deborah Gravano's head pops out of an office. And she got there right before me. So then a second later, Sammy the Bull walks out and comes stalking down the hallway straight at me, and when he gets about 15 feet away, says, "What the F do you want?" And I just remember he had eyes like a shark. He's a little guy, but he's stocky. He was built well, and it was intimidating. But I told him who I was and what I wanted. I wanted to do a story about his life in Arizona. And he insisted that it was, the first thing he said is, "Do you know how many people would be killed if you do that, or who will die because of that?" And the second thing is, it's not a story, it's boring. There's nothing to tell about it. And I insisted that I thought it was probably pretty interesting given his background. And so after a brief discussion in the foyer, he said, "Follow me," and he led me down this maze of corridors, deeper and deeper into this. We're in an old industrial area of Phoenix, and it was pretty spooky. And we sat down and started having a conversation, which ended up being that, yeah, people would die, but he would be willing to do an interview if I agreed not to write about his family and their life in the Phoenix area. So I ended up doing, my editors thought that was a fair deal, and I added a caveat. The whole deal would be off if he or his family or his company were involved in criminal activity in Arizona. So I wrote a piece, and we set up an interview, and it was kind of a weird interview because I went to his apartment. It was like a student apartment in Tempe next to Arizona State University, and he had a little mini Doberman pincher there, and he had a public relations person who had once been PR for a couple of governors in Arizona, and he had a lawyer with one of the most prominent law firms in Arizona there with him. And the PR person was so nervous about the whole deal that she was drinking wine throughout the interview. And the attorney had a bad back, so he was doing exercises on the floor during much of the It was just an odd thing. It went up, it was a long interview, and it was a really good interview. And basically, he told me that he turned on John Gotti and testified for the government. Not so much because it would get him out of a life prison sentence, but because Gotti had turned on him, because he had learned that Gotti had backstabbed him. So it was justified, even under the mob rules. But that he was an ethical mobster. He had never killed anyone out of passion or anger. His murders were all cold-blooded, and that was a good thing in his view because they were business. They weren't reckless. And I asked him if he had changed, and he said he was working with the FBI and he had changed, but then later he said that he's still Sammy to the core, and a leopard never changes its spots. And so I wrote an article about this, and as he predicted, it stirred up quite a media frenzy. The New York papers and stuff like that were descending on Arizona to learn about him. And at the same time, I was suddenly getting from various people saying, "Hey, you know that Sammy the Bull and his son are running the biggest ecstasy ring in Arizona." No offense to you, yours might have been bigger, I don't know. That's what they told me, and I started trying to look into that, and I not only was there an ecstasy ring of substantial size, but they were employing a bunch of high school and just graduated from high school kids who are wrestlers and football players from the town of Gilbert, like a real straight-laced suburban little town. And these people belong to a white power group called the Devil Dogs, and the Gravanos were using them as their muscle to enforce their dominion over the ecstasy trade and also to collect debts in Arizona. At the same time, I learned through some other sources that there was a law enforcement investigation of that whole ring. And what was interesting about that was it was state police and Phoenix police and Gilbert police were doing the investigation with the Attorney General's office. And they knew that Gravano was still testifying for the government in some mafia cases, and also in a case against a Bosnian war criminal, which he got to know in New York. And so they knew that he was a protected witness or had been. And they did not tell the FBI they were doing their investigation. So they got wiretaps on all their phones. They pretended to be applying for a job at Marathon Development and planted bugs in the office. They put a camera on a telephone pole nearby, and they surveilled for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then when they did the bust, I wrote a big story about that. We got a picture of Gravano being arrested. So that's kind of the tale. And the only other part of the tale where I'm involved is covering some of the trial stuff and doing an interview with Sammy The Ball in the prison, where he basically told me that he got involved in the ecstasy ring out of love. His son had started this ring with another guy, and Sammy was afraid they were going to get busted because they didn't know what they were going to do. He said all this without a hint of irony, even though they were busted. And so he decided to help them out by taking a mentoring role. The government's position was that he was actually the leader of this ecstasy organization.
That's really interesting, Dennis. Just for the viewers then watching this, if you just logged on, I'm here with Dennis Wagner, who is featured in this brand new National Geographic documentary, How E Busted the Ball. And also, I've read Dennis's articles over the years, dating back to the original article that, you know, put Sammy the Ball in Arizona doing his thing, which exposed his whereabouts to the Mafia. And then the sequence of events was a hit crew ended up in town that were going to assassinate him on the day that he was arrested. So at the end of that program, the National Geographic program, Dennis, the cop says that, you know, if Sammy the Ball were in the room right now, he would look you dead in the eye and say he had nothing to do with the ecstasy ring. What is this a case of where your brain you find a justification for your brain to contradict itself? Because it's like the old school Mafia thing is you don't get involved in drugs, do you? And that brings shame and damage to your reputation. Do you think it was the old school Mafia code that makes him have that cognitive dissonance?
Man, I'm no psychologist or psychiatrist, so I won't be in on that. I will say that, you know, when I interviewed him well, first of all, he pleaded guilty to some of the ecstasy charges. Now, he might say today, I pleaded guilty to protect my family because there was some lesser reduced charges or drop charges that accompanied that. So I could see him saying that. But he did plead guilty, and the wiretaps are pretty conclusive about his involvement. And moreover, when I interviewed him in prison, he made no bones about the fact that he'd actually gotten involved. He was playing a role, and he was playing a role because he wanted to guide his son. And he was really close to his son's partner in the business, too. So I think I can't psychoanalyze it, but I would guess if he said he had no part of the ecstasy business, he would probably mean that it wasn't something he started up. It wasn't something he really believed was part of his sphere, but he did it to help his kid. And I also think, I know that he told me when he was in prison that, yeah, the Mafia has a code about narcotics, but he never viewed ecstasy or marijuana in that realm. They're separate and apart from what the Mafia code regarding narcotics.
That's fascinating. So for people watching this, Dennis is available on Twitter. We're going to put the link below the video, and we're also going to put links to his articles down there below the video as well. So you've got a few questions have come in from the viewers. How did Sammy survive the Mafia if his crew were using his name to bully and push ecstasy? That's from Paulie Walnuts.
You know, first of all, he was really tight with the FBI and the U.S. Marshals Service, and he told me that they were protecting him. Now, it's important. I didn't mention this earlier, but by the time he settled in Arizona and doing business, he had divorced himself formally, officially, technically, from the Witness Protection Program. He refused to accept terms of the program that required him to be apart from his family, to have no contact with family members. They lived in Arizona, not with him, but right near him, and he spent a lot of time with them. And they actually worked at his business too. So he wasn't going to accept that. But what happened was they threw out the formal witness protection, but they retained the rest of it. And the reason was because the Witness Protection Program cannot afford to have one of its members, one of its protected people, getting killed. It's bad for their reputation. So he's out of the program, but he's still being basically a protected witness, and he was still critical to some of their cases. It might have been that they protected him. It might be that the Mafia's reach and ability to that kind of an assassination by that time was exaggerated. I just don't know the answer entirely.
So, just off the top of my head, I'm just paraphrasing. I think one of your articles, Sammy said something like, if Gotti's people come out here, I've got a few surprises for them. Could you expand on that, please?
I don't know what he meant by that. I can't remember. I assume I asked a follow-up question. But sometimes he would say things like, he would tell you that he's not afraid, and then he would tell you that he's afraid. He'd tell you that he hasn't changed, but then he would describe, or he has changed, but then he would describe how he hadn't changed. He was somewhat paradoxical in his comments. I'm not saying that they were totally contradictory. I'm sure that there was a rationale behind that kind of thing. But he talked, about how he didn't think they could get him because the marshals and the FBI would protect him in one sentence, and then if the bullets started flying, then maybe he'd be scared. So he kind of waffled back and forth on that. And it was interesting that he not only was using his name in the ecstasy trade, but just casually with people he got to know, he was letting them know who he was. He even told me he would tell business clients, he went by Jimmy Moran when he was in Arizona, but he would tell clients at Marathon Development, hey, just by the way, I'm Sammy The Ball Gravano. I thought you should know that because if I'm going to do this contract work, building you a swimming pool, you might want to know who's doing it.
Okay. Another question that's just come in. Did Gravano, what was his reputation after turning informant? And I'll add a little bit to that because in his book and in his interviews, he has said what you said earlier, that he was being used as the fall guy for John Gotti. And he was basically, trying to protect himself and his family from that. So he wasn't going to fall on Gotti's sword and sacrifice the rest of his life and not being able to spend his life with his family. Now, he's become a rising star on YouTube. I love watching Sammy The Ball's videos, his channel, and Michael Francese's channel on YouTube. I like my go-to channels for Mafia stories. And in the comments, a lot of people seem to be behind Sammy saying that, Gotti was going to sacrifice him. So we understand why you became informant. But then on the other side, people are saying that, well, it wasn't just Gotti that you testified against. There was 30 plus people, blah, blah, blah. So how do you view his reputation from then to now? Has it changed? Has he started to win the public over with this YouTube channel?
Well, first of all, I think that the question, you have to ask the reputation among who? Among the Gotti family and the families of those who got convicted because of his testimony, and there were more than 30, I think there was close to 40, people probably don't think his reputation is very good. Among his friends and family members, I think it's probably very good. Among the general public, I think there's dynamics here that are almost hard to explain. The public romanticizes mafia figures and kind of almost glorifies them. It's like they would be horrified by individual acts that they may have committed, extortion, murder, that kind of thing. But when they talk about the mystique of the mob, they get kind of excited and energized by it. And so I think that their reputation in that sense might be pretty good. Frankly, I've not tuned into the videos or anything like that, so I'm not seeing what they are. But I would guess that it's a mixture, depending on whether you romanticize the mob and whether you know about his history.
Do you think that the media, the movie makers, series such as The Sopranos are responsible for that romanticism? And is it true that Sammy was offered a part in The Sopranos at some point?
I think the media is responsible, maybe, but I also think that the media is feeding a public interest. The media is looking for what the public is interested in. Sorry about the dogs going nuts right now behind me, but so the media is writing about people they think readers would be interested in, and they bear a responsibility there. And the second half of your question had to do with whether he got offered a part in The Sopranos. I never was able to get anybody at The Sopranos to comment on that. I just know that he told me he was offered a part. And I got thousands of pages of wiretap records, FBI notes on the wiretap conversations where they were directly quoting extensive conversations between Gravano, his family members, and his associates. And those conversations, any one of them or all of them, could have been a script for The Sopranos show. It was so matching. It was unbelievable. With especially with the humor, the dark humor, the fighting, all of the different elements of The Sopranos show. It was just like that show was based on these wiretaps, but it wasn't.
So to the viewers watching this, I'm going to urge them to catch Dennis in the National Geographic documentary, How He Busted the Bull. Now, it kind of like built up to a point in that program where I think it was his son called him late at night and asked him for some money for fuel or gas or something. And it said that was the dad's response to that was what put him in the indictment. Looking at all these transcripts then, was there a lot more that Sammy said that ended up as evidence against him?
There was substantial amount more. It's in the indictments. It's in the criminal case. It's in his plea agreement, which includes a declaration of how he was found guilty. And there's two of them. One of them in the state court in Arizona, and one in federal court. I don't remember the details now. I mean, it's 22 years later or something like that. So I don't remember the precise details, but there were conversations about getting money. He was talking to his wife about getting money for this transaction, that kind of thing. And I believe those were the critical elements to it.
Have you kept in touch with the Gravanos? And if so, what's the latest?
Before they started streaming this recent show that they've started up, they talked to me about doing a story about plans for that. But my editors weren't interested in that story, so we didn't.
And what do you think about the success of Karen Gravano's book, Mob Daughter?
I haven't read it. I'm happy for people to have success. I don't say anything about it because I just don't know what's in it. Um,
Have you seen the show Mob Wives? Do you have any thoughts on such shows?
just that I didn't watch them. For me, Sammy the Bull was a really fascinating story, and there were some significant adrenaline rushes as I was pursuing it. In the end, it was another story, and as it was newsworthy, I was covering it, but I moved on and covered a million other things since then, and each one of them intrigues and engrosses me while I'm working on it, and then I move on.
What do you know about the Gotti hit team that was in town out to assassinate Sammy?
That one, you completely blew me away when you mentioned it. Why don't you tell me about that? Because that never came up when I was covering it.
Really? Well, apparently they had a sniper, I think. They had all the arms and everything, and they'd overheard. The feds had
What was the
overheard.
source?
I don't know. If you Google it, it'll all come up online exactly what was happening. But they had people in Arizona. I actually had a friend of mine called Wildman in Puerto Penasco, and he said that the Gotti crew had reached out to him. They'd sent someone up there. They were like on a scouting mission because they'd heard that we were Sammy's competition, and they wanted to see if they could get in that way. So there was, several plots going on, it seems, at the time, but they'd sent people out to assassinate him. And I think the hit was supposed to go down the day he got arrested.
Is this something that appeared in a later book or something like that? I'm not familiar with this story at all.
Yeah, you'll find it online. It's
I'll look it up. I'm a little skeptical about it, but.
Well, basically, the arrest saved his life, according to these reports.
This account, huh?
Yeah.
I'll be interested in finding out what the source is.
I don't know if they had bombs, guns, or both, but it was all very dramatic.
Because that information, I mean, I was still writing stories about Sammy for like 3 or 4 years because of the court cases and stuff afterward. So that information did not come up at least until 4 or 5 years after he was arrested and in prison. And it makes me wonder about it a little bit.
Yeah, it'd be a separate case, wouldn't it? It'd be a case, the guys who were who got apprehended for the assassins, perhaps it came out years later in their legal discovery.
Wait, did they get busted?
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. So there should be case paperwork there. I just can't remember the names.
Yeah, I'll find it. Tell me, do you mind telling me just briefly what your encounter was with the Gravano ecstasy ring?
Yeah, so I started my ecstasy ring about 1997, and it went until about 2001. And we had all the local parties locked down. But then all of a sudden, these new ecstasy dealers appeared. I'm wondering where the hell these guys come from. My wife, who had a girlfriend who was dating one of these guys, brokered a meeting with them. And that's where they started to ask me to move their product, and I refused. They got pissed off with me. And they were throwing the name out, Jimmy Moran, and then the one guy was like, "One call to Sammy the Ball, and we can have you taken out to the desert." That was the first time I heard the name, and I didn't know whether they were full of shit or not. So anyway, things escalated. One of my guys, he ended up getting his teeth knocked out, and they enticed him to a nightclub in Scottsdale. I moved to a gated, guarded property in Sin Vacus in the Catalina foothills, Tucson, because it got so dangerous. But it was really Gerard and Papa who were running the ring on the street level.
Right.
Those are the guys who were familiar with me and what I was doing. Sammy the Bull was at home. He wasn't doing any, hanging out on street corners or anything. But he was just a finance guy. That's the impression I got. Because someone recently asked Sammy the Ball if he was familiar with me, but they gave him, my name, the name I use now. They didn't say the name I had back then or anything like that. And I was operating out of the shadows anyway. And he said if he'd have been in competition with me, I'd be picking his bones out of my teeth.
Classic. That's so classic.
Yeah. But his son and Papa were very familiar with us. His son was a champion arm wrestler in Towers Jail, and my chief bodyguard, this big guy called Wildman. The one night when they sent us all to court, they chained Wildman to Gerard Gravano just to see what would happen. And because their crew had got arrested a year before mine, we pumped him for information really on the legal tricks of the prosecutors and the legal process. So we were all good after that. We squashed the beef once we all got incarcerated. And I've still been in contact with Gerard up to this year online a little bit here and there. Yeah.
Yeah, the one I heard from recently when they were talking about doing a story about their upcoming show was actually I talked to Gerard, and then I talked to Sammy too, and I had talked to Gerard when he got out of prison as well a little bit. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. What was the name you were using back then? Okay,
so they called it the Atwood Enterprise in the legal paperwork. On the streets, they were calling me English Sean, the Bank of England, or if it was reference to me and my friends who'd come over from England who were running it with me, Wildman and Wildwoman, they called us like the English family.
Okay.
Yeah. But we've run out of time, Dennis. A huge thank you for coming on. I will urge people to go on your Twitter and support you. We'll get a version of this up on YouTube in the coming week, and you will get a lot of follow through, hopefully. Is there anywhere else you'd like people to support you?
No, that's good. Just read USA Today.
All right. Cheers. Really appreciate it. And you keep smiling, Dennis. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye. Cheers.